See everyone here today. What a great opportunity this is for us to spend time encouraging each other, worshiping God, and joining together in a special way for those of us who are followers of Christ. In Matthew 18, verses 1 through 4, the disciples were arguing over or talking about who's the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And Jesus brings a child to him, and he says in verse 3, "Truly I say to you, unless you turn and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever humbles himself like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven." One of the things this passage really reminds us of is that there's a lot at stake in becoming a child of God, that if we don't become like that child, we will not inherit the kingdom. So when Jesus emphasizes in verse 4 the importance of humility, it's something that we need to take time to look at. What does it really mean to be humble? So if you'll turn with me to Romans, the 12th chapter that we read a little bit earlier. The Apostle Paul in that passage is talking about the fact that we are not to conform ourselves to the world, but we are to be living sacrifices. And as a part of that, in verse 3, Paul says, "For by the grace of God given to me, I say to everyone among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think." Now, he also goes on to make the point, but to think with sober judgment. We're going to take the first part of that thought. That's kind of what we're going to talk about today, is that danger that we have of thinking more highly of ourselves than we ought to think. This is really difficult for us. In most cases, we I think greatly struggle with the idea or trying to understand our place. And so I want to bring out 4 passages, I think, that Jesus uses to teach us about humility, Jesus or the disciples. If you look in Luke 14, Luke the 14th chapter, we're going to be beginning in verse 7. "Now he told a parable to those who were invited when he noticed how they chose the places of honor, saying to them, 'When you are invited by someone to a wedding feast, do not sit down in the place of honor, lest someone more distinguished than you be invited by him. And he who invited you both will come and say to you, give your place to this person. And then you'll begin with shame to take the lowest place. But when you are invited, go and sit in the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he may say to you, friend, move up higher. Then you will be honored in the presence of all who sit at table with you. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted." We'll be seeing that verse a lot, about the humbling and exalting. Most of us are probably familiar kind of with this situation of the wedding feast and choosing seats. In some ways, a lot of weddings, they kind of fix that by putting little placards that say, you sit here and you sit here, right? So I'm always right by the kitchen, and that's okay. But there's a tendency for us when we walk into any situation to, if we're not careful, we're looking for that place of highest honor. And so he says, by the way, did you notice as he's talking in this expression, how much, in this parable, how much of this is about how we think of ourselves? So in verse 8, he says, someone more distinguished than you. Well, we're breaking ourselves at that point, aren't we? And if you get moved down, then you have to move down, he says, with shame. Which again, that's a ranking kind of thing that we've done to each other. The humble child doesn't seek honor. And that's the point that Jesus is making in this passage, is he sees people actually doing this at a wedding feast and tells them, you're doing this wrong. You're putting yourself in this place of honor, and it's going to end up making you look worse, and you're going to not accomplish what you think you're accomplishing. So he says, go to that lowest place, sit there, and maybe you'll get moved up. And then you'll have that honor. I struggle a little bit with this because of how I think, which sometimes, I would go in and sit down in the place of lowest honor thinking, oh, I'm going to get bumped up. And I'm still seeking the place of honor in that case, aren't I? So we have to be careful about what Jesus is actually saying in this passage, because if you're saying, well, Jesus has given me the pattern to get honor, that's not really what he's talking about here. So it's about choosing not to put yourself in a place where other people will recognize you as someone who is distinguished. And I think that gets kind of to the root of the problem. Being recognized really feeds our egos. We like it when people recognize things. So when people talk to each other, we look for little clues in this kind of things. What is your job? And we rank jobs, right? Because if you're a sanitation engineer versus a doctor, there's a difference. Where did you go to school? What did you get your degree in? How much of a degree did you get? We have so many ways where we find ways to rank each other if we're not careful with those questions. Not just seeking information, but putting ourselves in those places. We need to be very careful, because the humble child doesn't seek that honor. He doesn't seek to be that one who is distinguished among others as someone who is special. So, danger for me is it's not uncommon for us to act like we're being humble when we're really wanting people to still honor us. So I'm not the kind that I always sat at the back of the class because I don't want to be in the front because teachers talk to you then. I always sat at the back of the class. It wasn't me going to the front or something along those lines, but still, there's this part of us that wants to be that noted. The humble child isn't going to do that. That's really what Jesus is saying in this passage. If you exalt yourself, however you do that, okay, there's going to be a humbling. But he pictures here also that recognition. And I love the way that he puts it in this passage, where the one who invites you comes to you and says, friend, move up. See, the recognition is a little bit different there, isn't it? It's not just about place, it's about relationship. And I think that's really important. You're not seeking that honor, you're seeking that relationship. Okay, what that reminds us of is we're not in a competition. And so often we put ourselves in that competition. We're kind of taught that from a very young age, There's always the cool kids at high school. Do you remember the cool kids at high school, right? And there were the cool kids in college or whatever, but we have this tendency to think this way. So this is about choosing to be in the least conspicuous place. And maybe I'm just happy to be here at this wedding feast where my friend is getting married, and being happy that I'm invited to the feast. Don't think more highly of yourself than you ought to think. Just be happy to be there and to have a friend. Luke 19, story we're familiar with, is in Luke 19 is I can't read even with my glasses. Luke 18, at least it's close. Luke 18, and in verse 9, he tells the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. And again, this is prompted by how Jesus sees other people acting, which is a clue to us. It's common. This is a real struggle for us. He also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and treated others with contempt. Two men went up into the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, prayed thus: God, I thank you that I'm not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and I give tithes of all that I get. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even lift up his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. Don't think more highly of yourself than you ought to think, right? That's what we're seeing so much of here. The humble child doesn't compare himself with others, and that's really where this parable fits in. One man sees himself as righteous, and he compares himself with another, and he holds him in contempt. At this point, what do we know about these two men? One's a Pharisee, which means very religious, very strict about his religion, and very much seeking after a relationship with God. The tax collector, at least from the Jewish point of view, was considered a traitor to his country. So he collects taxes for the Roman oppressors. So generally held in contempt, especially for those who were zealous for their nation. So they both go to the temple to pray. We don't give the Pharisee enough credit for that. I mean, at least he's there, right? He goes there to pray, and he's standing by himself, and he prays to God, and what is the focus of his prayer? I thank you that I'm not like them. Right? And he has a very specific example of the them in that case, especially this tax collector. But he has a list of other people, extortioners, unjust, and adulterers. It's strange how he didn't put in there self-righteous or things like that, what he was. That's the problem with comparing ourselves, right? Is that when we're comparing ourselves and we want to come out better, we notice our good points and their deficits. And we don't notice our deficits, and we don't notice their good points. So he's there making this comparison. I really wonder what he knew. I know it's a parable, but what did he really know about this tax collector other than that was his job? What did he really know? He assumed a lot. And that maybe is part of the problem of comparing ourselves, is how easy it is for us to look at other people and say, well, because you're this or because I've seen you do that, we make these comparisons. I thank you that I'm not like that person. That's not humble. That's thinking highly of yourself. Tax collector stands far off, not even lifting his eyes. In other words, he's not noticing the people around him, right? I think that's key for what the tax collector is doing here. He's not looking at who else is in the temple and making judgments about them. Well, we do that so easily even here, right? I don't like the dress she's wearing, that guy's not wearing a tie. You know, we make judgments about the back of people's heads. Just sitting in the pews. He doesn't lift up his eyes to heaven. He focuses on God. God, be merciful to me, a sinner. Jesus says he's the one who goes down justified. The Pharisee measured himself by considering others and found them less and him greater by that comparison. What did the tax collector focus on? His relationship with God and his place before God. So he asked for mercy because he knew he had sinned. But in that place and at that time, he was thinking about that relationship that mattered and not exalting himself by his own standards. Matthew 23. Again, very much based in real life. We're going to start in verse 1. Matthew 23, verse 1. Then Jesus said to the crowds and to the disciples, "The scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. So do and observe whatever they tell you, but not the works they do, For they preach, but they do not practice. They tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to move them with their fingers. They do all their deeds to be seen by others, for they make their phylacteries broad and their fringes long, and they love the place of honor at feasts and the best seats in the synagogues and greetings in the marketplaces, and being called rabbi by others. But you are not to be called rabbi, for you have one teacher. You are all brothers. And call no man your father on earth, for you have one Father who is in heaven. Neither be called instructors, for you have one instructor, the Christ. The greatest among you shall be your servant. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted." There may be a key phrase I used when I looked up the passages for this, right? If you exalt yourself, if you think more highly of yourself than you ought to, then you are going to be in trouble. So again, very real example, the scribes and the Pharisees, and they are people who are respected. In fact, Jesus says of them in this passage, they sit on Moses' seat. They have, to some extent, some authority. And he says, listen to what they say. But don't do like they do. So from the position of the scribes and Pharisees, they're in this place where they have studied and they know, they have authority, and they can tell you all kinds of things. And so Jesus says, for they preach, but they don't practice. And that's a real struggle for most of us. Now, he gives a perfect example of this, is that they tie heavy burdens on people, but they won't help you at all. So they're constantly looking at the people saying, you should be doing this, you shouldn't be doing that. Do we see that example in their relationship with Jesus? I mean, all the time they were coming to the disciples saying, why are they walking through the fields reaping? And they were just gathering a little wheat to chew on, right? Why didn't your disciples wash their hands before they ate? So they were full of the preaching, but they didn't practice. And later in this and other times, Jesus makes it very clear that their hypocrisy is that they were clean on the outside, dirty on the inside. They were impure in their thoughts and in the way that they acted. So Jesus is saying, listen to what they say, but don't be like them. And then you get that section that he goes through where they love the attention of others. It's a lot like the wedding feast. They're making sure people know who they are and are suitably impressed. And Jesus says, don't call people father and rabbi and teacher. And he emphasizes in verse 8, for you are brothers. Brothers. They had put themselves in this position of being superior and great. They should have been seeing themselves as brothers. Again, we still struggle with that, don't we? So, I don't know in particular, it hasn't really happened a while, but it's happened all the time. As soon as I moved to Texas and was preaching there, a lot of the older members, whenever they would introduce me, and they would say, and this is our preacher, David, right? And you could hear, by the way they said that he's at this point, right? And we're just, the rest of us are brothers, but he's the preacher. It bugs me. Because I feel like it's putting me in the place of exactly what Jesus is doing here. I wasn't trying to do it myself, but I've got enough ego that it's not a long trip for me to start thinking of myself as more than just a brother in a situation like that. The hypocrisy is that someone who's not humble assumes that they know better than you. The scribes and the Pharisees were the ones that had the knowledge and the teaching, and so they would preach it. they also think that what applies to you does not apply to them. That they're better than those things. That there's exceptions or reasons that you don't know or understand. So in this case, they preach but they do not practice. The humble child isn't a hypocrite because they understand it all applies to all of us. But these who are not humble see themselves, because they're thinking more highly than they ought to think. They see themselves as superior, not as brothers. They lack integrity. They lack true character of God. But they've completely missed the boat on understanding what God is about. So they preach all these things and they make it really hard for you to feel like you're doing anything right. And they're standing up there at that point of being superior. A humble child isn't a hypocrite. They know we're brothers, we're all in this together, and we have to help each other, or we're not going to make it. The last one I want to talk about is in Colossians, the 2nd chapter, where Paul uses this expression about, this one is not nearly as obvious as the others that we've talked about, but the humble child doesn't force it. Colossians, the 2nd chapter, verse 16. Therefore, let no one pass judgment on you in questions of food and drink, or with regard to a festival or a new moon or a Sabbath. These are a shadow of the things that are come, but the substance belongs to Christ. Let no one disqualify you, insisting on asceticism and worship of angels, going on in detail about visions, puffed up without reason by his sensuous mind, and not holding fast to the head, from whom the whole body, nourished and knit together through its joints and ligaments, grows with the growth that is from God. If with Christ you died to the elemental spirits of the world, why, as if you were still alive in the world, do you submit to regulations? Do not handle, do not touch, taste, do not touch, referring to things that all perish as they are used, according to human precepts and teachings. These have indeed an appearance of wisdom in promoting self-made religion and asceticism and severity to the body, but they have no value in stopping the indulgence of the flesh. So, at least in my translation, you don't ever see the word humble in that passage. What I'm going to tell you is that in my translation, the word asceticism that they've translated is the same word humble that we've been seeing in all the other passages that we've looked at. It's the very same word. They've got a very specific meaning in this place, and for that reason, I'm not saying it's a bad translation. I'm just saying it's different. But understand, we are talking about humility in this passage. And the reason I said the humble child doesn't force it is specifically in verse 18. Let no one disqualify you, insisting on asceticism and worshiping of angels. I feel like this passage follows really well after talking about the scribes and the Pharisees sitting in Moses' seat and telling people what to do. Now we have that same thing happening. Now it's with Christians. And some people were insisting on a forced humility, right? The asceticism that he's talking about here, a forced humility in this case, insisting on it. Did you notice in verse 20? He asked the question, why do you submit to these things? There's the hint at humility, right? The idea is that these people were saying, this is how you show your humility. Do not handle, do not touch, do not taste. So they're making these rules. And of course, in the passage, Paul makes the contrast that says, those are all physical things, and you're in a spiritual kingdom? Why are you doing that? Verse 23 is where he really brings it to us when he says that these rules that are being handed down by others, that are a forced asceticism, a forced humility, he says they have an appearance of wisdom. They look great. They look spiritual. They look like they're what we should be doing. They look great at making you look humble. But he says they have no value. There's no value at all. forced humility. I feel like even a false humility is what he's talking about here, don't you? The false humility of saying, well, because I don't touch this, and because I don't do that, therefore I am therefore humble. There's pride in that. There's thinking more highly of yourself than you ought to think. And that forcing can be forced by myself, by misunderstanding the scriptures, or forced by others. But he's saying in this passage, these are things that look humble, but we're actually depriving ourselves of things that are, in fact, lawful. So we end up following after the teachings and the judgments of men instead of honoring Jesus. Did you notice that contrast in this passage throughout this? These are the shadow of things to come in verse 17, but the substance belongs to Christ. So if you're forcing humility, if you're faking humility, you're on that shadow side. We need to be focusing on the substance that is in fact in Christ. Verse 19, not holding fast to the head. Again, reference to Christ. We need to hold fast to him, not to these doctrines that are coming from men and are very earthly. Verse 20, if with Christ you died, again, where are we looking? We're looking at Jesus, not what others are teaching us. Over and over again in this passage then, who are you going to follow? Are you going to follow the precepts that are clearly given by God and honor him and submit to him, or are you going to listen to the teachings and the judgments of men? Those teachings of men, he says, are very fleshly. Not only they're very fleshly, they don't help. You'll actually end up being more humble or more religious or more righteous because your focus is on those things instead of on Christ. He's made a clear contrast. So, to be properly humble, we must be aware of these dangers. Don't think more highly of yourself than you ought to think. One is seeking honor, putting ourselves in this place of honor where we want other people to see us. Be content to be a part of that. Or comparing yourself with others, and therefore often condemning them and exalting ourselves in those comparisons. The hypocrisy of saying all the right things but not doing them, and telling others what to do. And then the last one, of course, is this false or forced humility that focuses on following rules of conduct that are decreed by other people that look great, but they're not. Be careful, because when you give into those things, you're thinking more highly of yourself than you ought to think. Okay, in our lesson next week, we'll do the more positive side of the idea of humility. We'll talk about thinking with sober judgment that Paul speaks about in Romans, the 12th chapter. So that will be the plan. I hope this has helped you a little bit thinking about what it means to be humble. If you're a child of God and you need our prayers or help, we want to help you with that. If you are not a child of God and you'd like to use this opportunity because you believe in him to be baptized, please come forward as we stand and sing.